All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. So we're picking up here with the War of 1812, fast forwarding a little bit in American history. Remember this first chapter, we're just flying through different stuff that you learned about in 8th grade. So the War of 1812 was fought between the British and the United States. The reason war broke out is because the British were seizing American ships as we were trading with different Europeans, specifically France. And the British were issuing this policy called impressment. Impressment was essentially they would stop American sailors, take the ship, and force all the sailors to either join the British Navy or die. Those were their options. As more and more Americans were being forced into this issue, we had to do something about it. We were an independent country. We couldn't put up with that kind of disrespect from a foreign power, even one as powerful as the British. And don't get me wrong, the British were still the most powerful force in the entire world. The British Navy was by far the most superior navy over any other country in the world. Well, 1812 comes along. James Madison, the president at the time, declares war on the British because of these issues with disrespect on the open seas. The war fights on for a few years. We lose several battles, including infamously the White House is attacked and seized by the British. There's a lot of great stories about how horrible of an event that was. One example of that is that Dolly Madison was having a dinner party that night and had the table seated and plated, and there was food cooked. So when the British took it, they actually sat down, ate the meal that was prepared for the state dinner, then proceeded to burn the building down. Of course, Dolly Madison is also famous for grabbing the portrait of George Washington on her way out before they burned the White House down to the ground. And then, of course, it had to be rebuilt again. The war ends in 1815. There's not a lot of change in it. You can't say definitively the United States won the War of 1812 because we kicked some British butt. That's not true. We didn't kick their butt. We lost more battles than we won. But the fact is that we didn't give up boundaries. We didn't give up territory to the British, and the British agreed to respect our freedom on the open seas and stop impressing our sailors. So while it wasn't a definitive win for the United States, we didn't lose. And since we were this new up-and-coming nation, remember, we've only been a country at this point for about 30 years, and we could stand up to the British for a second time in our history and fight toe-to-toe with them was a major sign of respect for the United States. So although it's not seen as a victory, it makes us more respected as an independent, stable nation. Another famous figure that comes out of this that we'll be talking about is Andrew Jackson, the famous general that wins the Battle of New Orleans. And the big joke about the Battle of New Orleans is that the war was over. They had declared that the war was over. They're going to negotiate a treaty. And a few days later, Andrew Jackson leads the American troops into the Battle of New Orleans and is victorious and wins. And then he gets the note that, oh, by the way, the war was over. This battle was pointless. So, a little interesting historical fact for you there. Next thing we have on here is the biggest accomplishment of our fifth president, James Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is a foreign policy statement, a foreign policy responsibility of the United States. And essentially all it says is that the Americas, North and South America, are for the United States to protect, defend, and not for European meddling in their affairs, that the United States would work to keep the affairs in order of South America and North America and Central America without interaction from Europeans. Essentially, what the United States was trying to do is claim responsibility and power over a region and not allow Europeans to come in and continue to take over more territory and create spheres of influence for their own powers and more colonies for themselves. So when has this been enacted in American history? Several different times, actually. President McKinley in the Spanish-American War issues the Monroe Doctrine for it's our responsibility to kick the Spanish out of Cuba. President Roosevelt in the Panama Canal Project, that's Teddy Roosevelt, says it's the United States' responsibility to help North and South America by building the Panama Canal. President Kennedy, when the Soviet Union's trying to bring missiles into Cuba, is another example of the United States saying, hey, the Monroe Doctrine says this is our sphere of influence, not yours. Get out of our backyard. So a lot of different examples of that in American history. And also, you got to always ask yourself the big question. Is it the United States' responsibility to make sure Germany doesn't get involved in Venezuela? Is it the United States' responsibility in 2018 to still adhere by this Monroe Doctrine, or should we kind of be changing our philosophies? That's something we'll talk about in class. All right, so let's talk about that big winner from the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson. So Andrew Jackson ends up running for president, and he is elected to 2 terms as the presidency, and he's what we call a populist president. He appeals to the average person. Even though he was pretty wealthy growing up, he grew up in a state manor, he had quite a few luxuries in life. He appealed to the modern person. He chewed tobacco, and he talked like an average person, and he ran essentially a campaign of being an average person and relating to the average American, which really resonated with the American people. Now, with that being said, he's elected, and he is not as well educated as most presidents were. He's not as understanding of policy as most presidents are, and he wants to just kind of come in and stir things up and do things his way. And one of those things that ends up leaving a really negative legacy for him is the Indian Removal Act that he pushes through Congress and signs into law. The Supreme Court actually ruled it unconstitutional, and his famous line is, the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let's watch him enforce it. So he kind of breaks that separation of powers down in the checks and balances and adds more power to the presidency. There's a really famous political cartoon with Andrew Jackson dressed as a king, mocking his defiance of the courts. But essentially, the Indian Removal Act takes thousands of Native Americans that are living in the southern states in the United States, in Georgia and in Florida, and kicks them out and moves them farther west, and they're forcibly removed at gunpoint, and they're dying along the way of sickness, of starvation, of they're freezing to death in a horrible winter that hits this territory. So this reflects very poorly back on the United States in history, but you also have to remember he was a populist president. Was Andrew Jackson's decision to remove the Indians at that time period popular? Largely, yes. A lot of people liked the idea of removing these Indians and didn't mind that, hundreds of them were dying en route of being removed from their homeland. They didn't care about that. They wanted that territory for farming and potential gold mining. Another controversy with Andrew Jackson is his relationship with the National Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States is still under the original ideology of Alexander Hamilton, regulating currency, regulating trade, regulating our national debt, and trying to maintain economic order in the United States. Well, Jackson looked at the bank, and he wasn't entirely wrong that it was preserving the super wealthy in the United States and keeping them as elites, and it held on to the extremely rich's grip on the United States. Now, what he didn't anticipate is that when he killed the bank, he vetoed the charter of this bank, meaning that the Bank of the United States no longer existed. That eliminates that entity that's regulating currency and ensuring that our national debt doesn't get out of control, and ensuring that we're not going to potentially go to war with a foreign country because of our debts owed to them. He eliminates that bank. This leads to some chaos. This leads to confusion. This leads to the Panic of 1837 after he had already left office. So it was Martin Van Buren, the future president's mess to clean up. But it's the worst economic depression that we had seen ever up to that point in American history. And it was largely in part because Andrew Jackson didn't like the bank. And once again, this was a popular decision in the time period. So I always like to bring this up in broader perspectives. Just because a president or a congressman is doing what's popular in that moment doesn't always mean that in the future it's going to be remembered as a positive change in American history. And I think Andrew Jackson is the classic example of that. Thank you. We'll pick back up in our next video.